joining us. My name is Karen Fisher. I serve currently at Christian Family Solutions. We are a mental health counseling agency. For today, what I have been asked to speak with you about and to have you consider are some ideas around the idea of resilience. My moniker, or my brand, I guess I sometimes say, is living in grace, working with wisdom, transcending through humor. That as we interact with God's world, we do that always Christianly, but we can also learn from social science. Hey, front row is open, people. Come on up. We got 3-4 spots right in here. Perfect spots. There's other spots on the side too. But I come from the idea and the interest in what does psychology have to say, or what does stewarding our mind have to say about how we live our lives. So a couple years ago, I taught an undergraduate course in psychology, and one of the students in my class was a communications major. She wasn't even a psychology major. And I asked this question. The final question was, what do you think the point of this class was? And she said it beautifully, as a communications major would. She said, I think you were trying to tell us that God's the original psychologist and he wrote the perfect textbook. And I wrote back and I said, yes, and he gave us 5,000 years of human history to prove his point. Right? So when I look at psychology, that's the lens I'm looking through. What is it that we could do to psychologically steward ourselves? How could we use our brains and our understanding of human condition to improve how we serve each other? Right? So that's the focus of today. Hopefully you have a handout at your seat. If you do not, hands in the back, she can hopefully find us one. So, all right, here's where we're headed today. We're going to talk a little bit about why we need helping. Y'all are helpers. You serve in a helping role in some way or shape or form, likely. We're going to talk a little bit about servant leadership theory. What is it that comes into play when we talk about servant leadership? What's important about that? Compassion, fatigue, resilience will be the basis from where we're coming from to say, hey, there are things that go on when we're in a helping profession that may be unique to you, and to think about what could we do to improve our resilience around that topic? What are characteristics of resilient people? And then we'll do a plan and practice session. We'll ask you to talk about with a friend, their neighbor, how these things might apply to you. And we'll do that first in a story format, but then secondly, personally for you in your ministry. In the background, what is always happening? We are always resting on our faith to say that no matter what the challenges of life are, God has overcome them already, right? So the things that I might think I have to be resilient for, those are temporary. They are not permanent. He's already overcome the world, and by the world we mean all the people in it and all of the difficulties that come with life in that fallen world. So in the background, we always know that that's where resilience starts and where resilience ends as a Christian. I'm looking for heroes these days. Anybody else? This was my TV hero growing up. Some of you can relate. Mr. Rogers was probably one of the few shows we were allowed to watch at home. But I loved Mr. Rogers. He was the kindest person, wasn't he? And he really embodied what I thought Christianity was supposed to be. Now, we could get in an argument about that, but what he said, it was really helpful to me. And I remember it. I especially remember it one time when my son, who was very little, they started doing the children's sermons. Do you remember this? Children's sermons, do you guys have those? So all the kids run up to the front, right, and they sit down. And on his way back, he was probably like 3, on his way back from the sermon, the wrong grandpa grabbed him. And immediately, the woman next to grandma presumably, got up and helped him find my dad, right? He was very lost. He was very confused. He was very upset, and he needed a helper. And the helpers are everywhere. You are a helper, no matter if that's your paid vocation, right, or not. If you're just the grandma in the church helping a kid get to the great family, you are a helper. Look for the helpers. And what we've noticed is helpers need to be present all over the place. I've been using this particular site and stats for some while now. This is the Centers for Disease Control, and you can go out to this website and you could pick any geographic region. You can pick any diagnostic that you want, and you can look live, almost live data. This is from January a year ago, but you can get all the way to, I think it's now December of last year, and see what is going on with mental health trends. Let me just pull that up. Now, here's the bad news. The bad news is we're still at about a third of people who would identify with all the symptomology related to anxiety. A third of people would meet the criteria for the definition of generalized anxiety disorder right now. That's actually down from the height of the pandemic, 36%. Okay, so good news, things are improving. The helpers, though, the people like myself and the people that I work with, the people that I'm going to train, we can't reach all those people. Right? Some of those people need other helpers. And so events like this, places where I can go and be helpful to that is important to me. Helpers are going to come in a lot of different varieties. And we need them to be strong people because there's a lot to do. Sometimes when I work with helpers, like teachers or pastors or other lay leaders, I ask them to do one thing. Number one, I learned this from my friend Holly. Never ask this question, because you'll probably get that answer. How are you doing? Fine. I am fine. Right? I literally do not allow the word fine in answer to that question in my counseling room. If you're my client and I ask you, how are you doing today? And you say fine, we will start over. Okay? Because that means nothing to me. I need 2 more questions. Go 3 questions deep to figure out what somebody really wants to tell you. How are you? I'm fine. How's your family? Well, we got our challenges. My husband just had a knee replacement. Oh, is that hard for you? That he's home with his knee? I'm 3 questions in now, right? So now I finally have some information, some things I can work with. If you leave it at fine, you don't really know what you're working with. Okay? So just an encouragement to say, as you're being a helper, as you're understanding people, be invested, be a listener, be questioning a little bit more, and fine is likely not the final stop. Now, as a helper, people will often ask you that question. How's it going in your ministry? It's fine. Right? Is it fine? Right? Or do you need a little bit of help? So maybe some of the things that we're going to talk about today would be helpful to that. All right. I want to base this on some science and some ideas around leadership. And so we're going to talk a little bit about servant leadership theory. I don't know how many people love to study leadership theory. I enjoy it. But Robert Greenleaf was the first guy to talk about servant leadership theory from a secular lens. Remember what I said at the beginning? God's the original psychologist, wrote the perfect textbook, and now we got a guy in a secular setting who says, you know what great leaders look like? They look like servants. Great. So here are some traits that servant leadership, or personal attributes that servant leadership theory says are important. If you're going to be a helper in a servant learning situation, these would be the functional attributes, or the things it looks like to be a servant leader. So I'm going to ask you to do something here. Look at those 10 things. We're going to talk about them a little bit. I want you to, as you're thinking about them, as I'm talking, put a little X by 2 that you think maybe you have or that you use a lot. These are the 2 I tend to do a lot. Put an X by those, and then maybe put a check mark by 2 that someone close to you or another leader in your organization, someone you're thinking of that you work with a lot, put a check mark by 2 that you think they have. And they could be the same, but they might be different. So an X for 2 for you, a check mark for 2 for someone else. As we think through these servant leadership attributes, remember what I said about listening, right? The 3 questions deep, the conceptualization. I must be able to see the whole picture, that I grow people. Leaders often are people who invest more in others than they do themselves. Right? That's an important part of servant leadership. They have empathy. You'll learn this about me. I am low on sympathy, but high on empathy. Okay? We'll talk about the differences in a minute. They care about healing. That's probably why you're in a servant leadership role as you are now. They are aware of what's needed. They actually have persuasive characteristics. Jesus was fairly persuasive, I think, in the way that he did things. So we can model a lot of these servant leadership traits to support ourselves in the types of work we do as helpers. All those characteristics, right? All 10 of those characteristics, whether they're a characteristic you possess or a characteristic somebody across from you possesses, those attributes of servant leadership are important to being able to do your work. Somebody give me an example, maybe what you talked about, of why a characteristic might be important to work you would do, or why a characteristic of someone else would be important to the work you do. Listening is important. Why do you think so?
We have to hear what the people are saying to us.
Hear what people are saying.
What's going on in our church, what's happening with our constituents.
See what's going on in our church, what's going on with our constituents. Good. Another one.
Yes. Awareness.
Awareness.
Yes, knowing where people are coming from or what they've been through.
Knowing where people are coming from or what they've been through. That's amazing. Yep. How do I know how to help you if I don't know your story? I have to be aware of that. Great. One more.
Empathy.
Yeah, like the listening and the awareness build the empathy, right? If I don't do the listening and awareness, I can't empathize with your situation or how your life is going, right? Boy, it's like you set it up for me, friend. Because what we're going to talk about is that idea. What do I do when that gets hard? In the profession I work in, listening is probably what we think the most important skill of a counselor is, right? What's tricky is the empathy, because there are limits to which I can empathize with you and continue to do my job. So we're going to talk about that in great detail. Thank you for sharing that. Compassion fatigue is kind of what I was asked to focus on, and I gave you the servant leadership theory just because I think it's important to start with some basis, to say there's a way to set this up and there's a mindset you can have that helps. But that doesn't mean that we don't land in these challenging places where the listening and the awareness and the empathy are now weighing heavy. Okay, and compassion fatigue may be a relatively new term, but it's probably not a new experience. I love this definition. It helps us understand it. What's the difference between sympathy, empathy, and compassion? Sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Sympathy is I care about your suffering. Okay, I have feelings about it. Yeah. Empathy, I feel what you feel. I feel what you're going through. And compassion is I want to relieve that. I care, I feel, and I want to fix. You may be all three. It's quite possible that depending on where you work and what your calling is, that you are empathetic, sympathetic, and compassionate. In some ways, I think what research is saying is compassion fatigue has to do with the I am worn out. For some reason, I cannot fix your problem. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't empathize and sympathize. I probably do. But compassion fatigue is the idea that I no longer have the capacity to do the compassion work. I cannot care, feel, or act anymore in an authentic way. And there could be a lot of reasons that occurs. Okay? In counseling, one of the dispositions really is that ability to stay with the process you're in and then to stop that process and move on to the next. Okay, so if I'm going to see 8 clients back to back to back to back all day long, I do not get to empathize, sympathize, and be compassionate about client 1 while I am with client 2. And I don't get to do 1 and 2 while I'm with 3. And I don't get to do 1, 2, and 3 while I'm with 4, and on and on and on. Otherwise, I will never make it, right? My compassion will decline, and overall, my empathy and sympathy will likely decline as well. So compassion fatigue is important to understand, I think, the distinction. The reason that's important is because a lot of times our feelings get in the way of what we want to do. So we could still feel compassion and empathy, but we might not be able to do the work anymore. And sometimes that's what happens in ministry, right? We might feel very empathetic, we might feel very sympathetic, but we no longer can function in a compassionate way, and we have to step away from something maybe we love deeply. And it's an important thing to think about. What does compassion fatigue look like? So this is a word cloud I did with a group a few weeks back. And these are some of the words that kind of jumbled up in their minds in a little Menti that we did online live. Difficulty with is right in the middle, and then all the other words. Okay? Difficulty with feelings, difficulty concentrating, inadequacy, disappointment, cynicism, interpersonal challenges. These, when I encounter compassion fatigue, these are the experiences people usually share with me. Now, like I said, it is not common to be apathetic when you are working in a compassion ministry, right? That is not something we typically see. So when we see that, we know that there's some fatigue going on. And maybe you relate to this at some point in your life. That's what it looks like. I love research. I'm a PhD student right now, and one of the things I love to study is resilience. We're talking about that. And compassion fatigue has some interesting ways that it's built. So I'm going to go through some stats. You don't have to know p-values or anything like that. I'll explain it. But all this is saying is there are some factors that go into a person becoming fatigued or not. So a person becoming fatigued or resilient. The higher the number, the closer it is towards 1, the more it's correlated. Okay, so if it's a positive number, that means the two things are correlated positively or strongly together. Okay, so this top one, burnout, this 0.61, says burnout is very highly correlated to secondary traumatic stress. What do you suppose counselors encounter 24/7? What do you suppose teachers and pastors and ministry leaders tend to encounter more and more? Right? That secondary traumatic stress, that I am taking on the burdens, I am listening, I am aware, I am empathetic, and I am taking those things in. That's what I do all day long. That's what you likely do, or the people you support do. So burnout is very closely tied to secondary traumatic stress. Well, what would we do about that? I suppose we could just stop doing that, right? We could just stop hanging around people who are bringing us traumatic stress. And then the burnout would go down. It's one way we could fix that. Okay, the second number that's the most correlated is correlated in a negative fashion. And what that means is one goes up while the other goes down. Okay, so negative 0.59, self-esteem, which I'll talk about and clarify in a minute. Self-esteem is highly negatively correlated with burnout, okay? So if my self-esteem is higher, my burnout goes down. If my self-esteem is lower, my burnout goes up. That's what negative correlation means. So I could, if I wanted to improve this, I could change, in theory, self-esteem. Now that's interesting, especially in Christian contexts. How do I talk about that? What does that mean to have self-esteem? So typically in this measure that they're using, what they're looking for is the idea that I am proficient at my job, okay? So the more proficiency I have, the higher my self-esteem might be, which would lower my chance of burnout. This is why people who've been in a profession a longer time burn out less than people who've been in it a shorter time. I don't know about you all. In the circles I run, teachers who don't make it 5 years typically don't come back. Okay? They make it past that. Right? Their esteem, their ability to do their job, their confidence in the job has actually overcome their chance of burnout. So that's important. So we could work on that, right? We could kind of work on, hey, how do we get people to feel more competent in their work, and maybe the burnout would go down. That's one way to fight compassion fatigue. My favorite way, however, that we're going to talk about is this 0.53 number. And what that links is self-esteem with something called self-care beliefs. That if I have self-care beliefs that I rely on, that drive what I do, then my burnout will actually go down. Okay? I will drive up my own self-esteem by my self-care beliefs. Now, this is not anybody's old self-care. You don't know me yet, most of you, but I do not believe in self-care. I believe in this. I believe in self-care beliefs. Okay, self-care beliefs have a lot to do with how you see the world. What is your worldview? And Christians have a very distinct, and Lutherans maybe more so, distinct worldview. Why are you here? To serve God and others, right? And if all of your self-care beliefs come from that, if that's your self-esteem, and that's how you drive self-care, what you do will actually help you continue to do that thing. Let me show you how it works. So self-care beliefs, no matter what type they are, will drive self-care behaviors, which will then, in turn, either build compassion fatigue or compassion satisfaction. What do I mean by that? So if my self-care belief is, I need alcohol to get through my life, that's my self-care belief, right? Get home by 5:20, gotta have a beer, okay? That self-care belief drives a self-care behavior, which is drinking alcohol. Drinking alcohol literally depresses your brain, therefore, your compassion fatigue likely goes up. And if you keep that pattern, that self-care belief drives that self-care behavior, drives either compassion fatigue or compassion satisfaction, okay? So if we went over here and we said my self-care belief is that I do better when I meditate before I go to bed. I need a devotional. My self-care belief is I connect to Jesus. When I connect to Jesus, I actually feel more at ease. I sleep better. My self-care behavior improves my compassion. Okay? So it is not the self-care behaviors that actually change compassion satisfaction or compassion burnout. Why do I tell you that? Because more and more people are saying, I need an extra day off, or I need a week off, or I need a month off, or I need the self-care time. Okay, and I don't want to pick on people who are doing that. I want you to look at the belief behind it, though, because that's what matters, more so than the actual task. I'll give you more examples as we go. But this is the framework we're going to work on to say resilience, or the idea that I could build myself up to serve the kingdom better. That's what this is built on. My self-care belief is God wants me to steward my brain. I'm going to do that by understanding how to be a resilient person. And when I do that, I will have compassion satisfaction over compassion fatigue more than the average person. And that's what I'm looking to do, because then I get to serve God and others more. Okay, so the self-care beliefs drive those self-care behaviors, which actually drive the compassion. What you believe is more important than what you do. Let's link this back to some of our heroes. When you think of a resilient person, who do you think of? You got somebody in your brain? I'm going to give you 10 seconds. Who's resilient? Person you know, person in a movie, person in the Bible. Got him? Okay. We might think of Paul as a resilient person. Actually, he might fit the definition of compassion fatigue. This is a quote, and I quote, I despaired of life itself. Okay. In some ways, Paul had it. Shipwrecked, beaten, jailed. Right. Is it possible, though, that he was also resilient? Were there things that he was doing? Now, we know the end of the story. We know who he gives credit to. But were there things that he was doing that helped him continue to do the work he needed to do? And would that be true for you, too? All right. So we're going to turn to the next page, and I'm going to give you 3 sets of things. Now, these are not Christian integrated in and of themselves. These are social science. But you'll see pretty quickly how God's the original psychologist in these two. So we're going to talk about 3 sets of things, the elements of resilience, the view of setbacks, and then learned attributes. And they're attributed to some other authors you'll see there. So elements of resilience, this one just says, if you're going to be a resilient person, you're going to have a challenge mindset. If there's teachers in the room, you'll know that word. That is growth mindset, okay? I see a challenge and I say, bring it on. Let's go. That's a common characteristic of people who bounce back well, right? Whose thought process is, bring it on, I can do this, okay? Number 2, commitment. Resilient people tend to be people who keep commitments over time, and they don't need to be big. They just need to be consistent. And those commitments carry on day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and it does not matter how they feel about the commitment. If I could start teaching just this to the world, it does not matter how you feel when you make a commitment. You keep the commitment, and resilient people do that well. Number 3, personal control. They figure out what is actually in their control and what is not. Okay. During the pandemic, we launched an online support group for people over the age of 65 because they were trapped at home, most of them, right, more high risk and couldn't go anywhere. And I started doing this little design. It's not mine. You can use it if you want. You just draw a little tiny circle, and then you draw a big circle around it. And every problem you have, you just decide which circle does it go in, the little one that I actually control or the big one that I do not. See how this is Christian integrated, though? Who controls the whole circle? God does. I don't control any of it. There's resilience in Christianity. If I know that God controls all these things, I don't personally control any of them. That's relieving. Right? That makes me capable of doing more. Sometimes I think of it this way. It's how you think about it. Some of you might know this guy by the name of Alex Honnold. Alex was the first and so far the only guy to have ever climbed El Capitan without a rope. Okay? There's a movie called Free Solo. If you get time, watch it. Find it on YouTube. All that his resilience is built on is the idea that people confuse risk and consequence. Just because it would be catastrophic to fall off the mountain doesn't mean it's really going to happen, basically what he's saying. So if we use these characteristics and we say, I'm going to approach this with a challenge mentality, I'm going to say, all right, mistakes are to be learned from. He probably climbed that thing thousands of times with a rope, wrote down every move, he memorized it. Okay? That challenge mentality, that personal control. What do I control? I control the day I go. I don't control what happens. I just do the things I do, right? Those are all features of someone who can be resilient in challenge. All right, the next set is the view of setbacks, or the idea that resilient people tend to view challenges in a particular way. And so in front of these words, you might write the word no permanence, no personalization, no pervasiveness. So this is the idea that when I come up to a challenge, what do I see? I see it as impermanent. I do not see it as a permanent thing. As quickly as possible, I realize that this challenge is not forever. Okay? Not forever. The things of this world, right? We don't have to think anything is permanent. None of this is permanent. One of my questions for God, we have eternity with God, and I think it's because all of us have many questions, right? And one of mine is, why could we not give a frontal lobe to teenagers? And this is why, right? Because everything feels permanent, right? There is a way to destroy your life by thinking that the momentary struggle you are in is always going to be this bad. It does not work, okay? So viewing that as quickly as possible as impermanent is good. Personalization. Resilient people understand what they actually contributed to the situation they're in, to the challenge that's at hand, versus what else might be part of that. So they reasonably think through the challenge and they say, this is what I'm responsible for, but I am not personally responsible for the entire thing. Again, Christians at an advantage, right? We are in a sinful world. The challenges of your ministry have everything to do with the devil, right? Right? So to look at yourself and say, here's where I'm personally responsible, here's where I could improve, here's where I need forgiveness, that's real. But to say I own the entire challenge is not realistic nor true. So limiting that, some of us really are challenged by that. Pervasiveness, this is the idea that if I want to fall down and not do well, that I let every challenge move into the next challenge, move into the next challenge, move into the next challenge. So the idea here is to not be the Titanic. What do I mean? Okay. Anybody not seen the movie The Titanic? Okay, great. In case you didn't and you were shy about it, I just wanted to let you know it does sink. at the end. Okay, so I'm going to just let you know. But the way that it sinks is interesting, okay? This has to do with pervasiveness. The ship is just clipping along, not really super fast, I guess. I don't know, wasn't there. But it skims against an iceberg, okay? And the iceberg just pokes little holes. It's not this catastrophic thing, right? But what happens, the water comes in one hull, goes over the bulkhead, goes in the next one, goes over the next bulkhead, so now we're listing downward, right? And what has happened is the water has moved from one section to the next, to the next, to the next. That's pervasiveness, right? In your personal life, you don't get to take that to work. Your work life, you don't get to take home, right? Your relationship with your spouse, you don't get to take to your friends. Pervasiveness and the lack thereof helps us stay afloat, right? It's the reverse study of overwhelm. If I could keep everything in its lane, I will do better. Make sense? All right. And then the last set here is learned attributes. So here's the good news. If you did not have an experience where you had a mentor, a teacher, a parent who was good at these skills, you can still learn them. However, the sooner we learn them, the better we do. So here are 3 things that we could teach children that would be helpful. So number 1, empathy and compassion. Now, I'm among Lutherans, okay? And I know a lot about Lutherans. And so I'm going to read this one real slow. And I'm going to breathe in between the words. Ready? Resilient individuals do not waste time worrying what others think of them. They feel for others, but not with them. They encourage and support, but do not bow to peer pressure. And they enforce limits and boundaries. As Christians who work in ministry, how's that hitting you? Okay. We're looking through our resilience goggles here, okay? We're not looking through our mourn with the mourner goggles. Those are different goggles, right? From a resilient standpoint, if I am going to steward my psychology, if I'm going to manage my time well, if I'm going to serve whoever needs serving right in front of me right now, I have to have limits. Okay? And this one's a challenge. I think a lot of people I talk to don't know how to discern that sometimes. And what happens, right? They kind of get that compassion fatigue. I can't do this anymore. And this may be why, right? That the empathy has overcome them. So we have to work on that. Second one here is a lack of victim mentality. We see that people who do well tend to discern the difference between being a victim. So being a victim is a noun. It's who I am, versus being victimized, which means something bad happened to me past tense, which is true for everyone, right? So learning a lack of victim mentality to say bad things happen and we move on, as opposed to this is now who I am, okay? I work, in my prior work at Wisconsin Lutheran College, I worked in Title IX. Title IX is harassment and those types of things. Learned a lot about victim mentality there. The sooner you can get someone outside of this is who I am now, the better they will do. That's what this is saying in terms of resilience. Okay. Now, when we think about that from a multicultural lens, that's important. When we talked about empathy and understanding people, that's important. What is the mentality? What is the victimology of their life? Do we understand that? Okay. All right, the last one here is a positive image of the future. If we can teach people to see past the now, they do better in the now. Okay? And it doesn't have to be like positive. It just has to be an image of the future. I can see past now. When I was a freshman in high school, we had a tutor in our denomination, they call them. These are just like guys who are in the seminary, took a year off to be a teacher. Not really, but they're great. And our tutor, we came into religion class, 9th grade religion class one day. There were no chairs. There was nothing in there but a pile of white paper and a bunch of crayons. And tutor praying, he says, okay, we're going to take the next 47 minutes. I want you to draw your room in the mansion of heaven. I use that positive image in any situation I'm in now. Right? I was 14 years old. I still use it all the time. In a crisis, what does my room in heaven look like? Who's on my wing? I think I'm going to write a book about that. Like, who's on your wing in the mansions of heaven? Joel Mischke's on my wing. He's going to sit next to me. We're going to talk for hours. It's going to be awesome. Right? Picture that that positive image of the future will get you through challenges. Okay, there it is. Well, that's not really my room, but that's a pretty good one. All right, in your handout now, there's a little story there, and we're going to give you just a couple of minutes to work through this. So what's an example? How do we put this all together? And so here within the story of Irene, you're going to find all 9 of those resilience traits. They're all in there, okay? So I'm going to read it. You can flip back or have your page open to both sides. I'll read it, and then I'll actually have you partner up again and see how many of them you can find, okay? So as I'm reading, maybe be looking at your list so you're ready to talk with your partner. Here we go. Irene is, can't see that, 86 now. When she was 20 years old, she was struck with a terrible illness called polio. Pause. When I do this in high schools, I have to explain what polio is. Good news, right? That they don't know, but yeah, very interesting, right? She was rushed to a care facility and quickly learned that her illness was potentially lethal. Immediately, she evaluated the situation and determined she would rise to the occasion. She asked nurses and staff for exercises she could do and did them daily. She asked her brother to come to the hospital to help her keep that commitment. Irene will tell you that she believed that she would not go into an iron lung, a death sentence by most accounts. She was sure that although things were bad, they would not be permanently this bad. She had a teaching career to get back to, and this would not stand in the way. Feeling bad for herself was useless. She didn't cause the situation, and she would not be crushed by it. While Irene did feel sad for those who were in similar situations to her in the hospital, she did not allow this to determine how she would proceed. There was so much to live for, and she needed to work hard to get it. She relied on her faith as she had been taught to do. Over 66 years later, Irene still does 45 minutes of exercises daily, as well as a workout routine 3 times per week. She is convinced that this has saved her mobility, and no one can talk her out of continuing to work at it. She was able to build that life worth living that she imagined. She had help along the way, she will tell you, and she is a cheerleader and encourager for all those around her who question their abilities. Okay, trait number 1. Oh, there we go. Trait number 1, challenge. Where do you see a challenge mindset? Raise your hand if you have an answer. Challenge mindset. Where do you see that in the story of Irene?
Polio was a challenge.
Polio is a challenge. Where do you see the mindset? Determined to rise to the occasion, right? That's a challenge mindset. Determined. That's a great word. Okay. Next one. Commitment. What demonstrates commitment? Okay. Ask the nurse to do the exercises. When did she ask the nurse to do the exercises? Right away. Yeah. There's also something she did that's not addressed but is very important to commitment. Asked her brother. Accountability. Okay. So if you want to stay committed to something, get some accountability. It usually helps. Okay. Next one. Personal control. Personal control. Big circle, little circle. What do you see? Yeah.
She won't control whether she dies or not. She'll control whether she works out or not.
She won't control whether she dies or not, or even if she improves, really. She will control whether she works out or not. Yep. Yeah, interestingly, right, at that time, talking to Irene, the polio was cared for in wards. So you'd have 15 to 20 people all together, and they were of varying abilities, okay? So you didn't control what happened at all. You didn't even control if the doctor got to see you that day. Okay, so very important to control what you control in those situations. Right, permanence or lack thereof. Where do you see that demonstrated?
She knew it wasn't permanent.
It literally says the word, right? It won't be permanently this bad. Now that's an interesting thing to say when you have polio. I'll give you another example. We have friends whose now 30-year-old son was in a ski accident 3 years ago, broke his back. Okay, he did this the best I've ever seen it. The minute he was conscious, he said, "What can I do now?" Okay, whatever has happened now, it will not be permanently this way ever again. It will be different in the next moment. So that mentality or that idea that it will not continue to be like this, that's what allows people to do anything. Because if I thought it was going to be this bad permanently, I would do nothing. So that idea, it can and it does and it will change. Okay, great. Personalization, so not blaming ourselves. Where do you see that? She didn't cause the situation, okay? The backstory is she was a camp counselor that summer, my understanding is that children could carry the polio virus and not necessarily get it, and she probably got it at camp, okay? But again, personalization why would she get sick over someone else? Or why did that happen at that camp? Or why did she have to be ill? So not taking full responsibility is more realistic. It gives you a space to work in. Pervasiveness, the Titanic skill, where do you see that? Would not be crushed by it. That's a great example. What else do you see? Fighting daily, okay, so she's keeping going. Feeling bad for herself would be useless, so I can't have emotions about it really necessarily. I could just keep going. I think you also see her talking about that career to get back to, which could also fit under positive image of the future. Right? But this stays there. There's nothing to say you can't be a teacher if you had polio. Those two don't go together in her mind, right? Okay, that's the pervasiveness. Good. Last set, empathy and compassion. This one's a little tricky, but it's in there. Where'd you see that?
She was a cheerleader and encourager.
Cheerleader and encourager, right? So she has empathy. She can feel for others.
The other people that were in the similar situation did not allow, that didn't determine how she would proceed.
She felt sad, but that didn't determine how she would proceed, right? So empathy and compassion within reason, right? That because I'm sad doesn't mean I'm not going to do the things that I think are vital for me to do. I can do both, okay? So empathy and compassion, that idea that I can feel for without feeling with, and I keep moving. Good. All right, next one. Victim mentality or lack thereof. She's all that, right? I asked you to think of your resilience hero, right? Like this story is kind of not unbelievable. She's kind of the hero, right? Of lack of victim mentality. You don't hear it anywhere in the tone, right? Would not be crushed, right? That is not who I'm going to be. I'm not a victim. It's not my persona. Last one, positive image of the future. I gave that away, but she could see herself being a teacher, right? Yep. Build the life that was worth living. She could see what that was, and therefore she could work on it, okay? Now, that means that if Irene can do it, you can do it. I know she's the poster child, but now you know all the pieces. So the next part asks you to look at what are the 9 characteristics and which ones do I do well? What's one I might do well? And what's one that I might improve on? And how would I do that? Okay, so I'll give you an example. I'll take the commitment strength. I seem like a committed person. There's one thing that I am not committed to, and that is exercise. Okay? 360 nights a year, I think I'm going to get up at 4 a.m. and go to the gym. 5 nights a year, I actually get up and go to the gym. And what's ironic is I tend to enjoy it those 5 mornings. It's not like I hate it. Okay? That is not enough, though, to get me to go the other 360 days. And that's because it feels better to lay in my bed. Okay? So in order for me to work on my commitment skill, I would likely need some sort of accountability. That would probably help me. So my plan could be to sign up for the 6 a.m. yoga class and ask my friend Betty to go with me and put my shoes on before I go to bed or something, right? Wear my yoga clothes to bed. Yeah, so that would be my plan, and that's how I could improve on that skill. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm not going to tell you, A, which skill to improve on, or B, how to do that. You need to figure that part out. But I think as you look at the 9 skills, you'll likely find one that you're fairly good at. Work from that strength, too. Keep improving the one you're good at. But then look at the one that maybe is a challenge for you. Think through, how would I do that better? You could also go back and do that with some of the leadership skills, those 10 attributes. Same concept. You could go back to those 10 and you could say, I think in my role, the people I serve, if I improved in this way, that would be helpful to them. So that's another way to think that through. Okay, I asked you to think about your resilience hero. Remember, I gave you 10 seconds to think about it. You're supposed to think about who's resilient in your head. You got that person in your mind again? Tell me, does that person have any of the 9 characteristics we talked about? Do they look anything like Irene? Okay, likely they do. And likely you picked them because they're influential in your life in some way, right? It could be a storybook that you loved as a kid, could be your uncle who served in the army, could be your spouse, could be your child. Some people answer that, which I always love. This is Irene, by the way. And the gentleman who got up, did he say he knows her when he left? Yeah, I think he does. I think they live in the same building. This is Irene, literally. She is my mom. And I know. Let's try that again. Oh, she's fantastic. That is absolutely a true story. Every word of it. Now explain to me how I have no commitment to exercise, right? I think I'm just abstinent. But that is her actual story. And why do I know a lot about resilience? It's because I hung around with her for 52 years, right? I see it all the time. That's how I learn it. You saw it in the person you were thinking of. That's how you learn it. Someone is watching you, and they are learning it from you, right? So as you exhibit those resilience skills, as you work on them, as you continue to do that so that you can continue to serve, so that that compassion fatigue doesn't set in, know that you love God and you love others by doing that, right? Keep that in mind as you go forward. There are Irenes everywhere. I will tell you, she did come to this presentation one time and then she corrected me. She works out 6 days a week, not 5. She takes Sunday off. Yeah, I know. Here's another one we talked about before, a resilience hero. But what does Paul say his resilience actually comes from? Where does it come from? Not that we rely on ourselves, but on God. Right? Irene's the first to tell you. In fact, last night, I dropped off her groceries, and we were just chatting, and she explained to me that she had gone down to the workout room. She uses this machine called a New Step. It's kind of like a recumbent bicycle. And she's 92 now. This was a couple years ago that I wrote this. But we're just standing there in the kitchen, and she looked at me, and she goes, I don't know why I do that. I guess I'm just not a quitter. And then she said, I guess I'll just keep doing it until God tells me I can't. And I immediately thought of the first thing I told you about, self-care beliefs. She doesn't go exercise just because it'll help her lung improvement or her flexibility. Her self-care belief is that I keep doing it because God gifted it to me. That's why I do it. See how those self-care beliefs are more important than the self-care activity and how they continue to support her so that she can be compassionate in her life even at 92, 91 and a half. Right? That's an important feature. So hopefully that all came together for you and made sense. We are at the 1 hour mark, but I am allowed to stay for 15 minutes to answer any questions on compassion fatigue, servant leadership, resilience in general, any of the specifics. I'm going to start with David because I know David had a question.
So the compassion fatigue resilience model?
Yes.
The only difference between those two is that one self-care belief is good and one self-care belief is bad.
Correct. So if you're looking on the front page at the resilience model, the only difference is the output circle. So whatever belief you have will drive your behavior, right? In either case, whether you are fatigued or whether you are satisfied. Okay? So in either case, the belief drives the behavior drives the outcome. Okay? Irene does, her belief is, I am here to continue to serve, therefore I will exercise. That's why I exercise. That allows me to continue to be compassionate to other people. And I don't get tired of that. Make sense? Did I get it, David?
Yes.
Okay. Other thoughts or questions? Yes.
Pat and I we did the first 10 with Irene's story, and she actually fits with.
Oh, they did the servant leadership theory on top of Irene's story. Great. And she fits a lot of those too. I've never done that. I'm going to have to go back and do that tonight. Check your work. Yeah, interestingly, right? Servant leadership model should likely fit with a lot of the resilience traits. Wow. Now you got me thinking. There was another question here somewhere. Yes.
So this gives me a lot of good ideas for myself, but if I see somebody else who I see going through burnout, how do I share some of this with them?
How do I share some of this with a person headed towards burnout? Yeah. Typically when I talk about this, and I don't think I said it, I would ask you to put your own hat on first, okay? Because you're here likely in some ministry setting looking to improve and do better and continue to do the things you want to do. Number one to me is always modeling. It's very hard to get people to perform on command, right? So modeling some of these things and then pointing out what you're doing. I think conversation is important. Like, how is it that you keep doing this? Clinicians say this to me all the time. I don't always know the right answer to give, but I usually give them some sort of example, right? Like, well, today, this is what happened with my client today, so this is why I keep going. So I could give them, so there's modeling and then there's examples. You could just hand them the sheet. I think you got enough information there, you could probably run your own workshop on it. Can we sit down and talk about these 9 traits and how you're using them in your life? That might be helpful. I don't know. I think there's a lot of ways to think about supporting others, and I'd go back maybe to what was started. To listen, to be aware, and to be empathetic to their situation is probably the place to start. I know in our business, part of it is the acuity. So you know, like I said at the beginning, when we have secondary trauma, that's a challenge, it's a difficulty. But what's most helpful, I think, is listening. So when I sit with a clinician and just listen to their day, usually it's better by the end of our conversation. That's just my personal, I don't know if that helps, but you're welcome to use materials however you like. They're not my materials and they're well cited, so yeah.
I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but one thing in Irene's story that just stands out to me is the sentence of there was so much to live for and she needed to work hard to get it. So I get to work in my context with a lot of kind of just those 20-year-olds and that next generation coming up.
Yep.
And I almost feel like they're so much of a victim, if you will, of society and culture that says they should be dependent, looking for the handout. This idea of working less to almost protect yourself from working too hard, because that's going to lead towards burnout. And I love what this is, by the way, and just kind of piercing through this society right now that is very much pushing a narrative against this.
Yeah.
Maybe not directly, but almost subliminally, of all of these things are because of what other people or corporations are putting on you, and therefore being dependent on all these other things for you to survive, versus just plain.
Just plain
It
work hard.
sometimes takes you just got to work hard.
Yeah.
Right? I don't
There's
know.
that's an excellent point. I've done a little reading on that, and the shift has been from that I live to work to I work to live, which has to do with gig economy, for example, right? Like I don't identify as a Hewlett-Packard employee because I worked there 40 years anymore. That's not how it's going to work, right? And that has to do with generational psychology. There's a particular term called it's going to escape my brain. Slow life strategy, called slow life strategy. Dr. Twenge, Twenge, from the University of Washington, talks about that. And what it says is because of the generation, in a way that a generation is raised, it will take on certain psychological aspects as a group. And one of those aspects is the slow life strategy that says we have protected our children so much that they did not grow up to be adults. Most of them did not have jobs as teenagers. Most of them were in sports or extracurricular activities. They did not necessarily have to manage finances. They saw their parents go through the recession of 2008 and are afraid of adulting. So there's many features, I think, that play into their generational psychology that we have to live in and with, right? Yeah, and I get what you're saying, because if I do, I will tell you, we've done this particular program in high schools and middle schools. I don't know that the students caught it. I have no idea, but the theme of it resonates with them. Like, they know that that's a resilient person when they see it. They probably know because it's their great grandparent, right? Interesting, how to work against that, or to give them some tools.
It seems to me that the compassion, fatigue, resilience model, you could swap out these two things for stress and anxiety, or some other life thing, and depression, or just a lot of different things that you could put in here, and the self-care belief, behavior, you would end up with
The same circle. Yep. Yes, and in psychology, we would call that the self-activation trap. Essentially, what I do drives how I think or how I feel, and vice versa. So cognitive behavioral therapy works against that. But what it says is, yes, one perpetuates the other.
whether positive or negative.
Whether positive or negative. Yep, exactly right. This happens to be research on compassion fatigue. It's the first I've seen of a model, which I like. But yes, it's very psychologically minded in other ways, for sure. Yep. Great thought. Yes?
Because this is your mom, was there a period at all we didn't see in the story that she was overcome by grief, or she was in that space for a while, that she had to process that before she moved quickly into evaluating her? Did she have any of that?
Well, I say she was 20 at the time, so I was not around. But I have never heard anyone say that. Don't know if I've directly asked her in her life. I would have said probably not, that she probably moved very quickly. Now, she's one of 12 children, grew up on a farm up north, paid her way through high school, moved from Shawano to Milwaukee when she was 13 years old, and worked in someone's home as a housekeeper to go to high school. Okay, this was how she thought. So I suspect, nope, it was pretty quickly, let's go. Now, I don't know that that's typical. I think there's a grief process you would have, and I don't know that I've asked her that question. I could ask her. She could probably answer me. I think I know what the answer is, though. Don't you? From the story. Yeah. Yes.
There's a group called Resilient Recovery out there. The website or the email is resilient@crosswalkphoenix.com.
Resilient@crosswalkphoenix.com. Resilient Recovery is an associated ministry of Wells, and they focus on addiction recovery. So they have groups that they support that you can do in ministry, congregations, things like that. So they're a very particular way of talking about resilience too. That's a good point in books and things. Yeah. Jason, John. Other thoughts, comments, questions? I think we got about 3 minutes. Otherwise, you can be first in line to lunch, probably. Maybe just a closing comment. Thank you for what you do in service to God and others. I don't know most of you and what your ministries are, but I know that that it can be a challenge, and that God and the devil work in the world, and that you need all the support you can get too. So I'm hoping this was helpful and gave you some thoughts to work from in terms of servant leadership and resilience. So thank you for your time and attention. Enjoy your day.